been listening to Crowd Science on the BBC World Service. This week's question came from me, Jodie, from North Queensland, Australia. This show was presented by Marnie Chesterton and produced by Phil Sansom. Goodbye.
This is the BBC World Service, and in the forum...
We've all had a bad boss, from the downright incompetent to the micromanager breathing down your neck.
Your relationship with your boss is the single biggest factor that impacts your well-being at work, and it's the second largest factor outside of work.
So what makes a good one?
The forum. What makes a good boss? Saturday at 11 GMT. At bbcworldservice.com. Music Life.
I am MC Yala, joined by Katu Diosis, Chrisman, and Dave Master. We will be talking about working remotely, managing your time between touring and the studio, and staying true to yourself.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello and welcome to the History Hour with me, Max Pearson. First-hand stories bringing the past to life. This week, Osmond Mania. Singer Donny Osmond shares his memories of teen hysteria.
All these thousands of fans on the balcony and waving and screaming, and then all of a sudden there were screams, there were different kinds of screams. I saw the collapse.
Plus, how a 1992 Cambodian peace walk united the country.
I went over to their bowl and with my fingers just threw a bit of water over them and said, Songkriam Japai, which means the war is over. And they wept, and I wept.
Also, the Rana Plaza building collapse, 1,000 dead in the worst industrial disaster in Bangladesh's history, Mexico's murdered women when hundreds went missing in a border town, and how Lagos Fashion Week put Nigerian style on the map.
There's nothing as extraordinary as seeing an idea go from notebook to life.
First, today's news.
Hello, I'm Neil Nunes with the BBC News. Israel has kept up its intensified bombardment of the Gaza Strip, including the south of the territory where it had told Palestinians to go for their own safety. A BBC correspondent in southern Gaza says there was non-stop bombing and shelling by Israel overnight, some of it within 100 meters of a hospital. More from our international correspondent Lise Doucet.
We hear from the Israeli Defense Forces repeatedly now that this is the current phase of their military operation. But we're also hearing from the Gaza Strip this morning that while Israel says it's 320 airstrikes overnight targeted Hamas says infrastructure, Hamas cells, the strikes hit the north, where Israel had said people had to flee. It hit the center, but it also hit the south, which is meant to be the place that Gazans flee to, in Israel's words, for their safety and protection. And the Palestinian Authority is saying that Palestinian homes are being hit without warning.
The head of the main UN agency for Palestinian refugees in Gaza says that hundreds of trucks are needed to bring in supplies into the territory rather than the few dozen which have been allowed so far. Thomas White, the director of UNRWA in Gaza, said the situation in the south is dire. The BBC's Rushdie Abu Alouf is at a hospital in Khan Yunis in southern Gaza.
This place is a refuge for more than 1 million people who had to flee their homes in North and Gaza City. Here in the hospital itself, hundreds of people are taking the hospital as refugees. They are sleeping in the ground. They are begging from journalists. They are begging from medical just for food. I saw like 2 little boys. They were begging for food. They're begging for water, which is not available. People are not trying to secure anything just to keep their kids alive. They said they are either die in airstrikes or they will die from hunger.
In other news, a court in Pakistan has charged the jailed former Prime Minister Imran Khan with breaching the Official Secrets Act and damaging diplomatic relations. He's accused of waving a confidential letter at a rally last year. Mr. Khan said it showed details of a foreign plot to remove him from office. More details in this report from Caroline Davis.
The prosecution alleged that Mr. Khan's actions amount to leaking classified documents, which holds a maximum penalty of 2 years in jail, and damaging diplomatic relations, which can lead to life imprisonment or the death penalty. Mr. Khan's team say they will challenge the indictment and have previously said that he did not share the exact contents of the letter, only the gist, and that this did not damage relations. The trial is scheduled to start on Friday inside the jail, with no media allowed.
This is the world news from the BBC. The president-elect of the Maldives, Mohamed Muizzu, has urged India to withdraw all its troops from his country. The winner of last month's poll told the BBC that the independence and sovereignty of the Maldives should be respected, and Barasaneti Rajan reports.
The Maldives has long been under India's sphere of influence, and Mohamed Muizzu's demand is likely to trigger diplomatic tensions between Malé and Delhi. There are about 75 Indian military personnel based in the Maldives. India says they have been deployed to maintain and operate 3 civilian rescue and reconnaissance aircraft it had given the Maldives some years ago. Now, Mr. Muizzu wants them to leave the country as he promised during the election campaign. Mr. Muizzu is backed by an alliance that favors closer ties with India's rival China.
A surprise twist in Argentina's presidential election has put the left-wing candidate Sergio Massa ahead of his anti-establishment opponent Javier Milei. With most of the ballots counted, the contest will now go to a runoff vote next month. Many of the world's wealthiest companies and individuals are still paying very little tax. According to a new report from the European Union, it says there are still too many loopholes, allowing billionaires to pay rates of less than half of 1%, or in some cases no tax at all. Meanwhile, multinational companies are able to manipulate their profits so they appear in low-tax jurisdictions. Aboriginal leaders in Australia have expressed their anger at the failure of a referendum earlier this month that would have given Indigenous people more say in Parliament. One open letter accused Australians of committing a shameful act by voting no. Another said there had been a deliberate campaign of misinformation. The statements were released after many Aboriginal communities ended a self-declared week of silence. BBC News.
Hello, this is the History Hour with me, Max Pearson, this week's witnesses to history who've appeared on the World Service. Coming up, a survivor of the 2013 collapse of the Rana Plaza building in Bangladesh, Mexico's terrible history of murdered women in the 1990s, a peace march for Cambodia, and the somewhat chaotic beginnings of Lagos Fashion Week. So, some light and shade in our offerings this week, and indeed with the somewhat relentlessly grim news agenda of the past week, we thought we'd begin with a slightly lighter item. 50 years ago, the American heartthrobs the Osmonds were pretty much at the top of the pop music tree, and when they toured Britain in 1973, they were met by hysterical teenagers as their plane landed at London's Heathrow Airport. The crowd was so large that a viewing balcony at Heathrow collapsed. Donny Osmond has been sharing his memories of that time with Josephine McDermott.
7, 6, 5.
It's October 1973. The Osmonds are on the start of a European tour and have been besieged by fans every move they've made. Donny and his older brother Alan are watching television in central London.
I remember a moment. I was at the Churchill Hotel, and my brother Alan and I were in the room watching this television program. There were 3 people. There was the presenter. There was a child psychiatrist and a member of Scotland Yard.
Good evening. On Tuesday this week,
the topic of discussion was whether Donny Osmond should be deported from our country because of what he's doing to our children. Alan turns to me and he says, Donny, remember this moment because this never happens. This stuff never happens. And I watched it and I thought, I'm just singing my songs and they want to deport me.
OK, it might have been extreme to throw him out of the country, but how had things got to that stage? It all started for Donny when he joined his 4 brothers performing for the Andy Williams Show, an American TV variety show. He recalls his first live performance in Chicago.
I remember Andy introducing me. I ran out on stage, but the spotlights blinded me. I had no idea how many people were out there in the audience listening to me. So I sang my song, and afterwards there were so many flashbulbs going off, and cheers, and applause, and it scared me. And I ran off stage.
Oh.
And then the next thing I hear, I vividly remember this as a little 6-year-old, Andy saying, "Donnie, come back out here and take a bow. This is all for you." And I remember thinking, they're clapping for me. It was a moment that hooked me. And then the roller coaster started.
Fast forward to 1973, and Donnie, age 16, along with his brothers, are having huge success with hit records around the world.
Who can forget Crazy Horse? Every time I played that on stage, that horse sound, that horse whinny sound, would burn my fingernail because it was called a portamento. It was a velvet or felt or whatever it was, and I would hit it so hard because I was having so much fun, and my finger was on fire. I didn't care. And Jay and Meryl were singing the lead, and Jay was doing this dance on stage, and the smoke, the CO2 and everything. It was like, man, that was an exciting time.
And on the 21st of October 1973, it was time for UK fans to experience it. 10,000 girls waited at London Heathrow Airport, eager to welcome their idols from America and see them in the flesh. They had waited for hours on the concrete viewing platforms of the Queen's Building at Heathrow Airport, a mass of faces and arms holding Osmond scarves. On the flight approaching the airport, straight from a run of dates at Las Vegas, the band had no idea how many people were waiting for them.
We had different outfits to put on, so we looked really fresh coming off the plane. And I remember they said, the pilot even acknowledged the fact that we have the Osmonds on the plane. And so they wouldn't let us off the plane. They let everyone disembark, and they said, and now the Osmonds can leave. Dead tired, completely knackered, jet lagged, and they said, put a smile on because there's a lot of pictures being taken. I said, okay. We had our own transportation, a bus that they allowed us to go on the tarmac, and that's when they drove us around and they showed us the scene of all these thousands of fans on the balcony and waving and screaming. I think I had like on a yellow jacket or something like that. And I remember waving at the fans, and then all of a sudden there were screams. There were different kinds of screams. I saw the collapse of the balcony.
The wall's
The BBC was filming a documentary on tour with the Osmonds and caught the moment it happened.
It was just the pressure of the whole crowd. They just seemed to run up against the barrier. I just heard it crash. I just leapt forward and pulled them all out of the way. That's all I could do.
Sorry, yeah.
Well, that's all I can do.
Was anyone hurt at all?
Not to my knowledge, but I can't account for the people underneath.
The whole thing, it was falling down. The thing, I felt it go forward, and then it went, and everything all broke, and it fell on all these people, and it just fell off and went forward. And I nearly fell forward with it.
From what you saw, did you imagine that people might have been injured?
I expected the worst. I was surprised that there were no fatalities.
18 people were injured, 4 fans were treated in hospital, and the term Osmond Mania was used across the press.
Did you say you knew one of the girls who'd been hurt?
Yeah, friend. Yeah, she's our friend.
What happened
She's
to her?
inside at the moment. Oh, I don't know. She's just gone in hysterics, isn't she? You know, she pops up out of it, I don't think.
I played Donnie the archive footage. You're taken back.
Wow. I don't think I realized the scope of what was happening until I just saw this. And it's really weird what's happening in my brain right now. It's almost like I was watching a different person, even though I experienced it a long time ago. To me, it's a different person. It's hard for me to talk about this because it sounds a little bit egotistical. It kind of solidifies in my mind right now how significant, how huge that was back then. And I can kind of see now, because I've always referred to it as Osmond Mania, but I can see why now it's called Osmond Mania. It was mania. It was absolutely crazy. It was bedlam.
After they landed in London, there were similar scenes and minor injuries at concerts and outside venues and hotels.
What do you think of the effect of the Osmonds?
I think it's frightening, quite honestly.
One girl we had to take out that was absolutely fighting mad, and it took 4 of us to hold her down.
They've been waiting a year, they've been looking at pictures, they've been listening to records, and when they actually see them, it's too much, they can't handle it. And this is what it's all about. It's an outlet. I mean, men do it every week. Saturday afternoons, they'll go and watch football matches, right? They all go and watching 22 grown men kicking a ball.
But they aren't carried out.
And is it true that you were actually told you couldn't land at Heathrow again?
Yeah, we were banned from Heathrow. In fact, we had to fly into Scotland and take a secret train into London. That's how we could get into the city, was by a secret train. I wish I had the vocabulary. I just can't find the words of what it felt like other than pure excitement. Just to have that kind of adulation and people screaming your name.
I was going to ask you if that incident changed you in any way.
Changed me? No, because by the time that took place, I had already been in the business. I was a veteran by the time that took place. So I knew the importance of work and the value of work. And my dad would always just say, okay, that happened, now let's move on, let's do something else. You don't want to live in that too long, but it sure was fun. It was so much fun.
After the UK, the band went on to Germany, France, the Netherlands, Denmark and Sweden, and there were similar scenes. The terminal building where the collapse happened was demolished in 2009, and Donny Osmond is now allowed to fly into Heathrow.
The 70s heartthrob Donny Osmond was talking to Josephine McDermott, who has made a documentary about Osmond mania, tracing the beginnings of fan hysteria and looking at how it has evolved for BBC Domestic Radio. And Jo is with us now. So, looking at the history, when do we first see the types of scenes that we've just heard about there?
Well, although American pop singers like Frank Sinatra had girls screaming at them since the 1940s, it really wasn't until the 1960s, when the British band The Beatles came onto the scene, that the word mania started being used to describe the passion and the energy and the scale at which fans would turn out to try and get a glimpse of their idols. And in fact, there's a fantastic episode of Witness History in the archives on Beatlemania, when the band went over to America in 1964, and they experienced hundreds of fans waiting at Kennedy Airport for them. And Judith Kristen is the witness, and she talks about skipping school and the 1,500 fans that were waiting outside the Plaza Hotel for them, just to catch a glimpse of them.
And you've got the enviable chance of looking back at it from the other side, so to speak, looking back at the archive material from the 1970s with Donny Osmond, as we heard just then. What did he make of it now, 50 years on?
Yeah, it was fantastic to be able to show him the archive that the BBC recorded at the time in 1973. And I think that he'd forgotten how huge the scale was, really, of the scenes of those fans waiting at the airport. I mean, to have 10,000 fans pouring over viewing balconies waiting for a plane to land really is just something of its time. And he went on to say that he just didn't think that kind of adulation would ever be seen again for any idol, even the Taylor Swifts and Harry Styles of today. And his idea about that is that because of social media, there's no mystique anymore, and so fans feel like they actually can access their idols. And this is something that I went on to have a look at.
And in your research, what are your conclusions? Is that level of mass fan adulation now confined to history? We won't see it again?
Well, there's two interesting parts to this. I mean, of course, on the one hand, the times have changed. The internet revolution means people can feel like they're accessing their idols. But on the other hand, the psychology of being a teenager hasn't changed. And I spoke to Dr. Rebecca Tukaczynski-Forster, and she's an associate professor at Chapman University in the United States, and she's written a book about falling in love with media figures.
Parasocial relationships is the idea that we know a lot of media personalities over time, developing this sense of intimacy with them, like as if we really know them as people, even though obviously it's just an illusion. We don't really know them, and they definitely do not know us back. A lot of people assume that today's parasocial relationships are actually stronger than they used to be because you have this illusion of reciprocity, that you can watch them live, you can tweet to them, they may be tweeting back, as opposed to this one-sided relationship when you were looking up to this media figure that is very distant from you before the internet revolution. Talking to fans from different generations, I think that at its core, it's the exact same experience.
The psychologist's view of fandom today. And Joe, in the programme that you made, you've talked about your own experience following a band called Take That. Now, how has being a fan, in your view, changed in the last 30 years?
Yes, that's right. Well, one of the most infuriating things to come out of it, really, is how much easier it is in so many ways for fans today because of the internet revolution that was mentioned there. I mean, when I was 14 and trying to catch a glimpse of my idols, I needed an A to Z. That's a map of London that was in a book that everybody had who had to try and get around London. We relied on phone books, cold calling, recording studios, using telephone boxes. I mean, it sounds so archaic, but it was only the 1990s. And the idea that you could actually compose a tweet today and there's an outside chance that your idol might actually see it, I mean, that was beyond the realms of possibility when I was a fan. So I think in many ways it's a much more exciting time, but you know, everyone has their own experience and it's a fantastic thing to go through, really.
That's Josephine McDermott. Next, we're going to a different part of the world. It's a story from Cambodia's past and the attempt to bring the country back together after the appalling disruption of the Khmer Rouge rule between 1974 and 1979. It wasn't until many years later, in 1992, that the first peace walk was held in Cambodia, aimed at uniting the country which had been torn apart by years of conflict. Buddhist monks, Cambodian refugees and aid workers set out on the 415-kilometre journey, which became known as the Dhammayatra, or Pilgrimage of Truth. The hope was to find common ground between Cambodian refugees who had fled into Thailand during Pol Pot's rule with those people still living inside Cambodia's borders. Distrust and fear had built up on both sides, but that began to melt away during the 30-day trek, as Jane Wilkinson has been hearing from one of the organisers of that peace walk.
It was one of the most uncompromising and inhumane political experiments of modern times, killing great swathes of the Cambodian population.
In the parts of western Cambodia that we visited, refugees are still fleeing from violent clashes that erupt almost every day.
Those news reports from the BBC and Thames TV were looking back at the brutal communist regime that governed Cambodia in the late 1970s.
No one will ever know how many people have died under the rule of the Khmer Rouge. The estimates range from 200,000 to more than 1 million. Perhaps the man most responsible is the Khmer Rouge leader, Pol Pot.
Well, he and the leadership of the Khmer Rouge, they wanted to create a perfect proletariat within Cambodia and take it back to what he called the year zero.
That's peace campaigner Yeshua Mosapung Sawan talking about Pol Pot's Marxist rule, when money, private property and religion were banned and millions of people were forced out of the cities to work on communal farms.
Some people just fled to what became refugee camps in Thailand. People who couldn't handle the journey because they were ill or elderly or whatever simply died on the roads. And other people with basically no skills for survival in the countryside perished from disease and the workload.
By the time the Khmer Rouge regime collapsed in 1979, the country was divided between the Cambodian refugees living in camps over the border in Thailand and those who'd stayed behind in Cambodia.
The two sides had been heavily propagandized by whoever had control over them to fear and hate the other people. They would eat your babies, whatever. And so there was heavy racist propaganda, which left the population with a certain amount of fear and uncertainty. Who are these people and what's going to happen?
So Yeshua and other aid workers from the Coalition for Peace and Reconciliation set out to bring those two sides together.
We were talking about how can we bridge this fear gap? How can we bring about some level of understanding? And we realized that we needed some kind of event that was just larger than occasional workshops to make any kind of impact.
And that was the first step towards the Peace Walk, a 415-kilometre route from Aranyapate in Thailand to the Cambodian capital Phnom Penh. an event that would become known as Dhamma Yatra, or the Pilgrimage of Truth.
I don't remember exactly who floated the idea, well, would a walk be possible? But this is a way for people inside the country to see, okay, these are the people from the border, they're not so scary, they speak Cambodian just like us, they're Bangka-on, which means relatives. That was our idea, but everyone else we approached said it's impossible. It's impossible because governing authorities on both sides will never agree to it. It's impossible because it's such a harebrained scheme. It's impossible because there's too many dangers in the country. There's landmines everywhere. It's impossible.
It was Yeshua who was given the job of making the impossible possible. The problem was neither the Thai nor the Cambodian authorities had said yes.
Well, I had a slogan which I repeated constantly to people, which is, walks must always move. You always move forward regardless of what's going on. So we kept organizing for it anyway, as though it would happen. And we came down to the final day, and on that morning we got permission from the Thai authorities, and so we started moving.
The group that set off from Aranya Pratet was made up of around 100 people. Mainly Buddhist monks, some refugees, and a few aid workers.
In the front you had a charismatic elder Buddhist monk, very well respected, by the name of Mahagosananda. He was seen as a figure without sides. He took no part in the conflict. And he would speak every night that the walk stopped somewhere. And he used very, very simple language to talk about the need for compassion and wisdom to walk together. It gave the walk respect. I mean, bulletproof respect. You could not fault a walk being led by this person.
The walkers' first obstacle was the heat. Daytime temperatures of around 40 degrees Celsius meant they could only walk in the early morning. And the second?
We were carrying no food, no accommodation. We were totally dependent on the local communities. These communities were very poor, and water was scarce, food was scarce, but what they had, they gave. So my meal for the day would be a bowl of rice, maybe a little bit of prahok, if we were lucky, which is a Cambodian fermented fish paste, maybe some boiled grains. And they would bring out their sleeping mats from their home and offer them to us, and we stayed in Buddhist temples along the road in villages. That was our accommodation.
And in the early morning darkness of their daily walk, it wasn't their only support.
We would look down the road, and as far as you could see, there'd be little lights of candles, and there would be people sitting by little makeshift tables with flowers and bowls of water. And as the walk would go by, some of the Buddhist monks would take a branch with leaves on it, dip it in the water, and throw it over the people as a water blessing. Anyone in the line could do that. There was one morning, and there was a family on the side of the road, and they kind of looked at me, so I went over to their bowl and with my fingers just threw a bit of water over them and said, Songkriyam Japai, which means the war is over. And they wept, and I wept.
Something else was also happening that Yeshua hadn't expected. Cambodian families torn apart by war were being reunited.
There was one woman who walked up to me and she said very excitedly, I found my daughter after 20 years, and now she has a daughter. And she told me my other daughter is alive and I can see her when we get to Phnom Penh. Just one story after another. So it was this very deep connections that people were making, which went way beyond our simple plans. And although the name of the walk, Dhamma Yatra, meant Pilgrimage of Truth, some of them said, no, this is really Dhamma Titong, which means true connection. It was an unusual event. So when we would walk into an urban area, there might be thousands of people, and some of those people might join the walk to the next village. And people would walk from 15 kilometers, 20 kilometers away from the main road just to come to participate in it. That's just extraordinary. And it meant that this was the right thing at the right moment. That's something you can never plan.
After 30 days, the group that had now grown to about 1,000 walkers finally reached the Cambodian capital.
People walked quietly. It was very respectful. There wasn't cheering. It wasn't that kind of boisterous happiness. There was calm peace and happiness.
Yeshua Mosa Pongsawan, who helped to organise that 1992 Peace Walk for Cambodia, was talking to Jane Wilkinson. And just to mention, given events in Israel and Gaza, if you'd like to know more about the history of the Middle East, you'll find a collection of first-hand witnesses that we've recorded on our website. Search online for bbcworldservice.com/witness history. And there's more from the History Hour in just a moment.
This is the BBC World Service, where Professor Ben Garrett is meeting sensory innovators.
Scientists are coming up with incredible solutions to animal conservation just using sound.
The perception of sound is probably the only sense that all creatures on Earth share.
One technology supporting that revolution is AI-trained remote sensing microphones.
Conservation technology is super helpful for us because it basically provides a 24-hour ear.
Could we use a set of underwater microphones to help prevent collisions between boats and whales? And could we listen to an entire forest all at the same time?
AI will play a fundamental role helping us to actually extract useful and meaningful ecological and biological information from those audio files.
Sound Solutions at bbcworldservice.com/discovery or wherever you get your podcasts.
Coming up in part 2 of the History Hour, Mexico in the 1990s when hundreds of young women were kidnapped and murdered. The collapse of the Rana Plaza building in Bangladesh, killing more than 1,000 workers. And this.
There's lighting, there's music, there are people talking, walking past you. There's a frenzy of activity. Makeup is getting done, hairstylists at the same time. It was a frenzy of activity, to put it mildly.
The birth of Lagos Fashion Week. First, a news summary.
BBC News with Neil Nunes. Israel has kept up its intensified bombardment of the Gaza Strip, including the south of the territory, where it had told Palestinians to go for their own safety. Tens of thousands of people are sleeping in the streets and sheltering in hospitals. Hamas has continued to fire rockets into Israel. The head of the main UN agency helping Palestinians in Gaza says hundreds of truckloads of aid are needed every day. So far, only a few dozen transport vehicles have been allowed in. The militant group Hezbollah says Israeli airstrikes have killed one of its fighters in southern Lebanon. The Israeli army said it had targeted 2 cells that were planning attacks across the border. In other news, a court in Pakistan has charged the jailed former Prime Minister Imran Khan with breaching the Official Secrets Act and damaging diplomatic relations. He's accused of waving a confidential letter at a rally last year. The president-elect of the Maldives has urged India to withdraw all its troops from his country. Mohamed Muiz said the sovereignty of the Maldives should be respected. In Argentina's presidential election, the left-wing candidate Sergio Massa has taken an unexpected lead. Polls had predicted that his anti-establishment opponent Javier Milei would win the first round of voting. Many of the world's most wealthy companies and individuals are still paying very little tax, according to a report from the European Union. It says there are too many loopholes and called for a global minimum rate of tax. Aboriginal leaders in Australia have expressed their anger at the failure of this month's referendum that would have given Indigenous people more say in Parliament. The statements come as many Aboriginal communities ended a self-declared week of silence in protest against the vote. BBC News.
Welcome back to part 2 of the History Hour with Max Pearson. Still to come, a very dark period in Mexico's recent past when hundreds of women were murdered in one area near Ciudad Juarez in the 1990s. And the driving force behind what has evolved into a fixture in the fashion calendar, Lagos Fashion Week. But before that, a story of corporate greed winning out over workers' safety. In 2013, Rana Plaza, an 8-story block on the outskirts of Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, collapsed. The building contained several factories making clothes for the Western market. More than 1,000 people died and many others were injured. It was the worst industrial disaster in Bangladesh's history. Dan Hardoon has been looking back at that dreadful event.
It looked like the aftermath of a massive earthquake, the 8-storey building collapsing in an instant.
Rescue workers in the Bangladeshi capital Dhaka are continuing to hunt for survivors.
On the 24th of April 2013, Rana Plaza, an 8-storey building on the outskirts of Dhaka, collapsed, killing more than 1,000 people and injuring many others. The building housed 5 garment factories which manufactured clothes for several well-known high street brands. I've been talking to Parul Akhtar, who worked as a sewing machinist at Rana Plaza and survived the disaster.
The lives of the survivors have been destroyed. They can't work anymore. I didn't think for a single moment that such a tragedy could happen and thousands of people would die.
Since the 1980s, rising global demand for cheap, fast fashion and low production costs have helped Bangladesh become the second biggest exporter of clothes globally, just behind China. Bangladesh's garment factories employ about 4 million people, most of them women from poor, rural backgrounds. These jobs allowed many women to enter the workforce for the first time and achieve some kind of economic security. But the sector has been plagued by problems including low pay and terrible working conditions. The Rana Plaza disaster wasn't the first incident to expose poor safety standards in Bangladesh's garment factories.
A fire at a clothes factory in Bangladesh has killed at least 8 people and injured dozens.
A fire at a big garment factory in Bangladesh has killed at least 25 people and injured many others.
Parul Akhtar started working at Rana Plaza in 2008 when she was 18, sewing t-shirts, shirts and trousers.
The environment was not good, but we had to work there because we were hungry and needy. There was a lot of noise coming from the machines and the other workers. I felt suffocated. Suppose I was feeling a bit ill or a bit down. If production failed, the managers would insult us and remind us of our hourly targets.
Parul's working day often lasted 12 hours or more. Including overtime, she got paid 9,000 taka per month, equivalent to around $110 today. On the 23rd of April 2013, a day before the collapse, building inspectors noticed cracks in the walls of the Rana Plaza building. The building was evacuated, and shops and a bank on the lower floors were closed. The next day, Parul arrived at work at 8 a.m. as usual. Her husband, who worked in the same building, went with her. A crowd of workers had gathered outside, unsure whether to go in, given the emergency evacuation the day before.
There were 4 or 5 factory owners there. They were pressuring the workers, telling them, if you don't go inside, how will I meet my targets? And usually on the 25th day of the month, the bosses would pay overtime money and bonuses. So this was my dilemma. If I don't go into work, I won't get my money. That's why many of us went inside the building and started working.
Parul entered Rana Plaza at around 8:30 that morning. Just before 9 a.m, there was a power cut, prompting the electricity generators to kick in. This caused powerful vibrations throughout the building.
There was a huge blast. I was scared and started running towards the stairs. Something hit my back. I don't know what it was, maybe a pillar or a machine. I didn't see. I fell to the ground and fainted.
Parul has no memory of what happened next, but it took another 8 hours until she was finally rescued from the building. The next thing she knew, Parul woke up in hospital. She had to have an operation on her right kidney, but in those first few hours, all Parul could think about was whether her husband was safe.
My husband got severely injured. He had 2 heart attacks after the collapse, and now he has to take lots of medicine. He lost one of his eardrums, and there are many issues with his eyesight.
In the days after the collapse, there were angry protests as garment workers filled the streets demanding safer working conditions. The disaster also made headlines globally, with Pope Francis comparing the working conditions inside garment factories to slave labour. A total of 1,134 people died during the Rana Plaza collapse. More than 2,500 suffered injuries.
I lost many close ones. There was someone at Rana Plaza who was like a brother to me. I lost him. Even my own sister got hit by a pillar and had a blood clot in her brain. And now she too is living a very terrible life. I am not lucky. Sometimes I feel like if I had died that day, then I would have been lucky. The life I'm living now, I don't want it. I can't work. I can't afford to educate my children.
And who do you blame for what happened?
I blame God and the factory owners as well. If they had closed the factory for the day, the generators would not have started and the building would not have collapsed. Most of all, I blame the building's owner. He only had permission from the government to build a 5 or 6 story building, but he made it an 8-story building. He's the one to blame.
In the aftermath of the collapse, it emerged that the upper 4 floors of the building had been constructed illegally without proper permits. The building's architect said that Rana Plaza had been designed to house shops and offices, but wasn't strong enough to withstand the weight and vibrations of heavy machinery. Sohail Rana, the building's owner, was arrested 4 days after the collapse. In 2015, murder charges were brought against Rana and 37 others, including factory owners. But the case has been postponed several times on different procedural grounds. And recently, Bangladesh's High Court announced its intention to grant bail to Sohail Rana, a decision that the government is challenging. More than 10 years after the disaster, not a single person has been convicted of murder.
My request to the government is to convict the building owners and the factory owners. My other request is for the government to help the victims. For example, to manage their medical treatment and provide proper compensation.
A compensation fund worth $30 million was eventually set up for the families of Rana Plaza victims. This included contributions from some of the brands that manufactured clothing there. But a 2019 report by the charity Action Aid found that compensation has been patchy. Parul told me she'd received around 50,000 taka, or $460, towards her medical costs. But in common with half of survivors, she remains unable to work due to the long-term impact on her health. Since the Rana Plaza disaster, there have been some reforms in Bangladesh's garment industry. The government says new regulations on fire and building safety have resulted in factory renovations and safety improvements. An international accord to expand health and safety provisions in Bangladesh's factories has been signed by 200 brands and retailers. But some major clothing brands have yet to sign up. For Parul, these changes have come too late. She's still haunted by her memories of the 24th of April, 2013.
Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night. I often feel like someone is following me. I check under my bed and in the toilet. Even after all this time, I still haven't overcome the trauma.
Parul Akhter, a sewing machinist who survived the collapse of the Rana Plaza building in Dhaka, was talking to Dan Hardoon. We're going to Mexico next, and a story from the past which shocked the world when it was finally told. In 1993, young women began disappearing around the border town of Ciudad Juarez. Hundreds were reported to have been kidnapped and killed. Some of the first victims weren't discovered until nearly 10 years later. Mike Lanchin has been looking into the grim background to this story.
It's late 2001 and forensic scientist Oscar Maynés is on his way to work in Ciudad Juarez, a city renowned for its violent mixture of drugs and crime.
I believe it was a Thursday morning. I was driving and then I got a call that they found one body in an area inside the city where an old cotton field used to be. Before I got there, I got another call that they found another body. And then a few minutes later, when I arrived, there were already 3 bodies.
All 3 bodies were of young women in different stages of decomposition. They'd been dumped in the open on the old cotton field close to the city centre.
There was still a patch of old agricultural field still in the middle of the city, but there was traffic all over the place. You know, cars, buses driving back and forth. We started processing that area to see if there was more bodies there. And the next day we found another 5 bodies in another ditch 200 meters from the first one. However, these bodies were buried.
It wasn't the first time that Oscar had come across such grim scenes in his hometown. Juarez had been plagued by similar killings of young women since the early 1990s. But a combination of poor and corrupt policing had meant few cases had been solved. Oscar and his team set to work, gathering clues as to who the latest victims were and why they'd been killed.
The first 3-4 days, we spent most of the time there all day processing the scene, because you need to uncover the bodies, with brushes, like you were like archaeologist, to see if there's some a sign or mark that could tell you how the girl was murdered. And we also had to control the pressure of the families that were looking for their daughters, the media, and then at that time the Attorney General had the idea of bringing heavy machinery to turn over the whole area, and then we had to also be careful with that because it was going to ruin everything.
What were you thinking? What was going through your mind at that time?
Unfortunately, I was expecting something like that.
Almost 10 years earlier, when the first women's bodies had begun to appear, Oscar, then working as a trainer in the police academy, had warned his superiors of an emerging trend. Young, attractive women, many of them newcomers to the city, picked up by strangers, violently assaulted, then killed and dumped. By the end of the 1990s, more than 100 bodies had been found across Juarez. Word was spreading that Juarez had a serious problem.
After being lured or kidnapped from the shanty towns, the girls end up dead out here in this vast wasteland that surrounds Juarez. Whoever is killing them is making little attempt to cover up the evidence. The bodies are simply thrown out like a piece of rubbish amongst the beer bottles and household trash and dead animals that litter this area. This is the place where the latest victim was found only 2 weeks ago, and as you can hear, it's only a few meters from a main road.
Nosotros llegamos a Ciudad Juárez en el 95.
We came to live here in 1995, but even before that, we'd heard that young women were disappearing and turning up dead in Ciudad Juárez. As a mother, that was one of my main worries. But my husband said to me, "Don't worry, there's lots of work to be found there."
Juarez had become a magnet for poor Mexicans from the countryside, like Paula Flores and her family, who were keen to get a job in the city's newly built foreign-owned factories. Paula's husband had begun working in one of the factories, as did her daughter, 16-year-old Sagrario. Sagrario's shifts began at 6 in the morning and ended at 3 p.m. But on April the 16th, 1998, she didn't come home.
I used to watch out for her from the door of our house. I could see the bus stop from there. But when it got past 6 o'clock and she didn't come, I started worrying. So I sent my son off to call the factory to see if she'd stayed behind to do some overtime. When he came back, I could see it in his face. "She's not there," he said. And that's when this nightmare began.
Distraught, Paula and her husband rushed to the local police station, only to be told, come back when the girl had been missing for 72 hours.
Toda la gente casi de Lomas de Poleón nos ayudaron a repartir volantes, empezamos a...
So we started giving out leaflets and photos of her. We went all over the city, handing them out. We did that every day for 2 weeks. At night, when it was all quiet, I would go outside and call out her name, hoping she would hear me.
The victims' families come to the police headquarters every Monday. They put up pictures of their dead relatives and hope for information. But amongst the chaos, no one seems to take much notice.
The lack of official commitment in solving Sagrario's disappearance was nothing new, says Oscar Maynés.
I mean, you need to understand how things work here. Most of this, the police positions are political appointments. Also, you need to understand that since these women, they were labeled prostitutes, so there wasn't much interest of investigating the murders.
But they weren't by any means all prostitutes. In 1995, police arrested an Egyptian chemist living in Juarez and charged him with some of the murders, but the killings carried on. In 2001, the case of the 8 cotton field victims caught the media's attention. The authorities rushed to produce results, arresting a group of bus drivers.
The bodies were found on a Thursday. I was arriving at my office the next Sunday, like at 7 a.m., and there was a lot of commotion, and basically the Attorney General went public and said that the cotton fields murders had been solved already. They already had the confession of the killers, and then actually I didn't believe it.
Days later, Oscar resigned in disgust.
Behind these murders, you have an organized group with resources. And when you talk about resources in Juarez, you're talking about either drug dealers, businessmen, or sometimes are the same. And of course, you have the collusion of the authorities by omission, because when they decide not to investigate, when they decide to fabricate, just for political reasons, they also protecting the murders.
2 weeks after her disappearance, Sagrario's body was found half buried in the desert. A distinctive white factory tunic with her name stitched on it was found beside her.
I didn't see my daughter's body. They didn't let me see it. I wanted to see it, to be sure it was her, but only my husband went to identify her.
But why didn't they let you see her?
Well, my husband said to me, "Don't come. You'll get too upset." But when he came back, I felt so stupid. I've regretted it for the rest of my life. If only I'd seen one of her hands or something of her, with my own eyes, then I could say it was my daughter. But no, I still can't believe that she's really dead.
Paula Flores and the forensic scientist Oscar Mayneth were talking to Mike Lanchin in 2013. Finally this week, one of our occasional forays into the history of fashion. In 2011, models, stylists and fashionistas gathered for the first ever Lagos Fashion Week. It would put Nigerian style on the international map. As Rena Stanton-Sharma has been hearing from the woman who was the driving force behind that first event.
Walking in that moment, I just felt, wow, this is possible. There's nothing as extraordinary as seeing an idea go from notebook to life.
Omoyemi Akoreli is the founder of Lagos Fashion Week. I spoke to her in Selfridges, London, the luxury department store where a fashion pop-up by African designers was held earlier this year in collaboration with her event. Omoyemi told me about the moment she walked into Echo Hotel in the heart of Lagos's Victoria Island on the 26th of October 2011, witnessing her dream come to life.
There's lighting, there's music, there are people talking, walking past you. There's a frenzy of activity. Makeup is getting done, hairstylists at the same time. Our first backstage, it was a frenzy of activity, to put it mildly, but I was happy that it was happening. I mean, we barely had a backstage. In the middle of all the calm within the storm, you could also see beauty, right? You could see people. You could see people who were committed to their craft. You could see people giving their best, people who bought into the vision.
To the sounds of drums, models walk the catwalk of Lagos Fashion Week. African designers are showcasing their best work as international ones descend on the city looking for talent and inspiration at a time when Afrobeat and African fashion seem to be taking the world by storm.
That BBC report was from 2018. Omoyemi's flair for fashion flourished from an early age, but she studied law before pursuing her passion.
If you spend so much of your life focusing on a particular career and then you wake up one day and realize you're not enjoying it. Imagine going to law school and having degrees and starting work as a fashion intern. Yes, that was me. A fashion intern, worked as a fashion stylist, became the fashion editor of a lifestyle magazine. I remember talking to my editor at the time about Fashion Week, like this is what I would like to do because I think it's going to bring more meaning, more purpose to the work I do and what I felt I'd been called to do at that time.
Her idea was born in 2009 when she was the artistic director of Style House Files, a fashion agency she founded for African designers in her home city of Lagos. Omoyemi was used to working hard, and planning Lagos Fashion Week was fraught with challenges. Organisers of other fashion shows in Nigeria called on designers to boycott the newest show in town.
It was quite a controversial season because different platforms were very threatened by what we were doing, and they'd actually gone ahead to tell all the designers not to showcase with Lagos Fashion Week, and they threatened that they wouldn't take them to New York. They used to have like big events in New York then. So quite a few designers did not showcase with us in the first season.
But many decided to take a stand and support Omoyemi.
Some of the designers in this room now said, of course not, we're going to showcase because we believe in what you're doing. We're committed to it. For us, fashion is not just about entertainment. This is about developing our creative economy, our own people. It was really heartening to see everyone just rally around, come together to say, you know what, despite the threat we've received, we're going to showcase with you.
The next conundrum was building the catwalks and exhibition spaces, which was turning into a logistical nightmare. The evening before the grand launch, Omoyemi went to the hotel to check on progress.
Been talking to production crew, especially the technical crew, all day, about setting up and walking in about 8 p.m. Nothing was set up, like literally it was bare. And I went straight into panic mode. What's going to happen? And then you have the technical department saying, don't worry, everything's going to be fine. We'll be sorted. The catwalk itself was already built, but lighting wasn't done yet. It was just panic all around. And then looking in the exhibition space, plan A didn't work. The first company that we'd hired, they were not able to deliver. So between 6 and 7 p.m., we're calling on a plan B for someone else to try and work overnight to create that, because the other company was stuck in a different part of Lagos. So you walk in and you expect a place to be done, and then it's not done, and then you're calling someone and they're telling you, Madam, the car, it's broken down, traffic. This is like 2 hours on the outskirts of Lagos in suburbia. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, if this doesn't come here, the exhibitors cannot set up. If the exhibitors can set up, this isn't going to happen.
Omoyemi recalled that conversation she had in Yoruba with that workman. There were just hours to go until the grand opening, and everything was up in the air.
There was no sleep. Of course not. We'd murdered sleep. There was no way you could go to bed, rest assured that you stroll in the morning and everything will be fine. We were there till literally 4, 5 a.m. in the morning, just making sure everything was set up, good to go. Because we just couldn't leave it to chance that everything would be fine at 9 o'clock or 10 when doors open.
The day she'd been working towards for years had finally arrived.
I was just completely blown away. I mean, we look at the photos today and we laugh like, oh my gosh, did we really have a yellow catwalk? We laughed at all the things that just didn't look right. But it was really a heartwarming moment to see everything come together in that way, bearing in mind all we'd been through, all the obstacles, everything. In that moment, it ceased to be Omoyemi's vision and became this collective vision that we all bought into, because everybody brought their best, from the hairstylists to the makeup artists to even the lighting technicians, and that for me is the real magic about Lagos Fashion Week.
Since that first show, packed with Nigeria's sartorial glitterati, it's grown to become a major fashion occasion, attracting Africa's biggest celebs. Collections from the catwalk are now sent around the world, as these BBC News reports from 2018 reflect.
Yeah, we have international photographers, like we have stylists, we have different people from Africa, from Nigeria, from Paris, from Milan, from New York, from London. We have a lot of them here, trying to see what Africa, what Nigeria, what Lagos can present.
We are starting to make a name for ourselves and show that actually we do have the standards of luxury and the standards of production that the rest of the world does have as well. We're no longer the continent of disease and poverty.
International press and buyers were looking on from the front row, making decisions about the collections that could end up in our high-end department stores as early as next year.
And they still are. And that's why I'm now sitting with Omoyemi in Selfridges, in the heart of London's West End.
There's been a ripple effect across the continent. Yes, people realize that we do have talent and people are buying African, wearing African with so much pride.
Omoyemi Akareli, the driving force behind the original Lagos Fashion Week in 2011, was speaking to Rena Stanton Sharma. And this year's event gets underway in Nigeria's largest city from the 25th to the 29th of this month. That's it from this edition of the History Hour. We'll have more first-hand stories from the past for you next week, but until then, from all of us here, this is Max Pearson. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.